Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to our presentation tonight, Women's Voices in Practical Theology. This is our second annual Women in Theology and Ministry lecture, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our speaker. Jane Regan is Associate Professor Emerita here at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She completed her Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of North Carolina and received her Master's of Arts from Fordham University. She received her PhD in religious education from the Catholic University of America. Dr. Regan's research and teaching focused primarily on adult faith formation and the interdisciplinary work of bringing adult development, adult learning theory, and the dynamics of faith communities into theoretical and pastoral dialogue. Dr. Regan's academic background is complemented by her educational and pastoral work. She has been involved in religious education at the diocesan and national levels for many years. Dr. Regan is a nationally recognized author and speaker with a particular focus on adult faith formation and catechetical leadership. 2009, the National Conference of Catechetical Leaders honored Dr. Regan with its Catechetical Award, which is given annually in recognition of outstanding or exemplary contributions to the ministry of catechesis. A great honor indeed. Professor Regan is the author of a number of books, including Toward an Adult Church, A Vision of Faith Formation, First Celebrations of Gathering Together, First Celebrations of Reconciliation and Eucharist, and Forming a Community of Faith, A Guide to Success in Adult Faith Formation Today. Her most recent book is Where Two or Three Are Gathered, Transforming the Parish Through Communities of Practice. Although now retired from our School of Theology and Ministry, Jane continues to teach and to work on a variety of writing projects in religious education. She formerly served as the director of this continuing ed program, and we're so grateful that she's come back to join us tonight for this wonderful presentation. A warm welcome to Jane, and it's great to see you back here with us.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for the introduction. You know, I'm really honored to be invited to do this presentation because I follow in the footsteps of a great woman and a great theologian, Francine Cardman, who gave last year's first Women in Theology and Ministry lecture, and I'm honored to follow her. Okay, I'll admit it. I tried to do too much. Kind of a straightforward title, you know, Women, Voices in Practical Theology. But in fact, every word of that title deserves interrogation. Women, or those who identify as women. But what women? Who is present under that rubric and who is missing? And is that in contrast to men or in opposition to men? Is that legitimate? How about voices? I drew my research primarily from writing in the field of practical theology, often written by members of different academic settings. But who isn't included in those voices? And I'll be taking a subgroup of that group. Is that the only way to examine these themes? And practical theology itself is itself fraught with challenging questions and conundrums, as becomes clear as we proceed. So just parsing these words could be the talk. And to some extent, many of the themes I just mentioned will be considered in the next bit of time. As I continued my research for this presentation, I came to think of this as an introduction to a wider project that I think would be quite interesting to pursue at further depth. So I propose this presentation as a way of setting out the core themes, and equally important, the core questions that shape practical theology as examined, discussed, and practiced by women. So this is kind of the plan for the day. We're going to begin with a quick introduction and an equally quick practical theology historical context, and then move into looking at the identity of as practical theologians, the characteristics of practical theology, and then looking to the future. The methodology that I used in exploring this topic was fairly straightforward. I read as much as I could that was written by women practical theologians in the past 15 or 20 years. The first interesting observation is that much of that consists of collections of essays edited by women rather than a full-length book. Let me propose that the fact that they're a collection of essays, let me propose that this says two things. First, it says something about the nature of practical theology at this time. Perhaps it is a time to bring diverse voices together to explore the foundational themes from various perspectives and various positions. Or perhaps it has simply not been the time when writing a grand synthesis would seem to make sense or be helpful. And secondly, I think it says something about the way in which women think and theologize best. Bringing their individual insights into dialogue with one another is a strength that women bring to this practice. In any case, the five main books that I looked at are these: Prophetic Witness, Catholic Women's Strategies for Reform, edited by Colleen Griffith; Opening the Field of Practical Theology, an Introduction, edited by Kathleen Cahalan and Gordon S. Mikowski; Invitation to Practical Theology, Catholic Voices and Visions, edited by Claire Wolfdyke; Conundrums in Practical Theology, edited by Joyce Mercer and Bonnie Miller-McLemore; and The Wiley-Blackwell Reader in Practical Theology, edited also by Bonnie Miller-McLemore. In each case, at least half of the writers are women, with the exception of the book on prophetic women, which consists of 26 essays, all of which were written by women. The other difference with prophetic women is this: all of the other books that I've read contain articles written by practical theologians about the nature and work of practical theology. Prophetic Women is a collection of essays by women from a variety of theological fields with a focus on doing practical theology. In addition to a lot of reading, I also interviewed 3 practical theologians whose work has been significant in the field, in the doing in or defining or both. Each comes from a somewhat different point in their career and bring unique questions and perspectives to the discussion. You'll be hearing me read excerpts from the interviews throughout the talk. And of course, I bring my own perspective and questions. For the past 45 years, I've worked in the field of religious education. For the first 10 of those years, I worked at the parish and diocesan level. And for 35 years or so, I have been teaching at the university level, mostly with graduate students, and fundamentally in the field of religious education with a focus on adult education. For most of that time, I thought of myself and named myself as a religious educator or a religious education theorist, depending on the audience and the mood. I came to understand myself and to name myself as a practical theologian over the past 10 or 12 years, for many of the same reasons that the persons I interviewed came to name themselves in the same way. The understanding of practical theology that we're looking at today has really come into being over the past few years. Now, to describe the evolution, which continues into the present, is beyond what we need to do tonight, and what we have time to do, and probably beyond what you'd be interested in or need to know. Believe me, you can live a good and holy life without knowing about the beginnings of contemporary practical theology. But I want to make 4 points that I think will help you to understand the kind of the insights and direction that practical theology has taken. We can begin by looking at Vatican II as a point of reference to speak about a contemporary sense of practical theology. The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, serves as a frame for thinking about the work of practical theology. At its opening, the document makes clear that Vatican Council II calls us to attend to the joys and hopes, the griefs and problems of the people of our time. In addition, it goes on to say, the Church has always had the duty to scrutinize the signs of the times, interpreting them in the light of the gospel. Secondly, the work of practical theology has been an important part of the Church's life from the beginning. Now, while we'll be looking at the present reality of practical theology, we can't forget that for many years, and in fact across the history of the Church, we have had men and women who have been engaged in the process of practical theology. In the early Church, we can think about the early writers that make up the New Testament. They are writers of the Gospels and Paul, for example. They are people who have brought to us a reflection on the time and the space in which they lived, responding to the questions and practices of the time and bringing those practices into dialogue with the tradition towards hoping for a better future. And they have a smattering of bishops, early bishops, who also brought that same insight into their writing. St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, and St. John Chrysostom. Each of these, during the 4th and 5th century, provided insights into what it meant to live and to be a Christian in the world. My third point is this. One of the key contributions of the move from the seminary to the university was a significant factor in how practical theology evolved. Now, I'm not talking about the move from the monastery into the early universities in the 11th century, although that also had a significant impact on the way in which theology was done. Here, I'm thinking about the move from the seminary into the modern university that happened in the years following Vatican II. Following Vatican II, and in response to the call that all are called to holiness, and to recognize that all are called to be about bringing about the reign of God, universities like Boston College, Notre Dame, Fordham, Catholic University began summer programs that were designed to provide lay people and women religious primarily with new theological insight, and often to prepare them for new careers in ministry. As a matter of fact, when I did my own studies, I got my master's from Fordham University, as Father Stegman mentioned, and I came there as a layperson right out of college, and I was by far the minority of those present. The majority of the people were members of religious communities or priests on sabbatical who were coming to learn about the new theology. So that the sense of the presence and the reality of the practices of the Church, of the practices of the people of God, became more a part of how theology was being done. And it was in that context then that practical theology began to take on more importance and more focus within the theological world. And the fourth point I want to make is this. There has been a growing awareness of the close relationship and mutuality informing theory and practice. Throughout a good bit of history, the understanding of the relationship between theory and practice was one of theory providing the information, the insight, the propositions, and practice being kind of the delivery system. So if you're a religious educator, you provide delivery, the information to the children or adults that you were teaching. That shifted during this time into recognizing the dynamic relationship between theory and practice. So there was a relationship and a recognition that practice informed theory and theory informed practice. Now, that has been an important part of how practical theology has evolved, because it moved away from being simply kind of technical learning, the learning how to, and began to develop on its own sense of itself as a discipline. So that today we have within practical theology, we have the presence of our own literature, our own guild, and really our own methodology that we'll be looking at in just a few minutes. To look at and continue talking about practical theology, I want to introduce to you the practical theologians whom I interviewed for this project. They are Colleen Griffith, who is a professor of practical theology and faculty leader of the spirituality focus here at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Mary Elizabeth Moore, who is Professor Emerita of Practical Theology at BU. She was also Dean of the school at BU and Director of the Center for Practical Theology, retired. And then finally, Teresa O'Keefe, who's also here at Boston College. She's Professor of the Practice of Youth and Young Adult Ministry and comes to us with a good deal of background and experience in that area. The first question I asked them is this: what drew you to practical theology? In what way did you come to name yourself as a practical theologian? And I'm just going to let them speak for a bit about their own experience. Mary Elizabeth Moore said, "I was always drawn toward action for the social good. And alongside that, I was curious about theology and philosophy. I read everything I could. When I was about 24, I was teaching an adult Sunday school class where everyone was older than me. But I thrived on it. I loved the topic and the discussion and the preparation. When I had very young children, I would get up early in the morning to prepare for the Sunday school class because I loved thinking about these things and loved thinking about them with this group of people, a very interesting mixed group of people. As she continued to do work in the church, youth work, etc., she began to decide that she wanted to go on and get a degree in the areas. And so she talks about her first experience in a practical theology course. This is her first practical theology course and her last one, actually. When I took that course in practical theology, from day one, I thought, this is me. And so I discovered that this is the way that I think. These are the questions that I'm curious about and what I want to do and what I think I could contribute. So I just identified myself as a practical theologian and a religious educator. I was home. Similarly, Colleen Griffith talks about being drawn to practical theology as well. What drew me to practical theology? The methodology. I was trained as a systematician with my area as theological anthropology, with big interest in theology of the body. So what drew me to practical theology was the fact that there were systematicians who were very interested in the methodology of practical theology and were starting to use it. I just knew I'm interested in theological anthropology, and I'm interested in body, and here is a whole theological area which takes the body very seriously. She went on to say, in other words, the body is seen as a place or base for thought. Practical theology takes the reality of there not being one singular body, but bodies plural very seriously. It considers things like affect and agency to be integral to whatever you do theologically, which is bodily grounded too. This is fascinating. I'm a systematician. I work in the area of theological anthropology. I'm serious about the body, and here is a whole developing area of theology that I want to know more about. I would say I name myself to be a practical theologian because that methodology is how I do systematic theology. And Teresa O'Keefe had much the same thing to say. I've come to name myself a practical theologian. I found that was what I was doing. It wasn't like I think I want to be a practical theologian. I was, by my vocation, a religious educator. And I discovered over time that is a modality of practical theology if done well. She goes on to say, and by that I mean, it's not simply an application of theological things to practical settings, but it was recognizing more and more that the practical setting informed how the theology was done. That's what makes it practical theology. You're taking life on the ground seriously as part of a theological reflection and construction. I take the context seriously, the setting seriously. What is it saying about humans and about God? Clearly, for all of them, the methodology behind practical theology is what drew them into participating in that area. And that really brings us to the second question that I asked. What characteristics do you think constitute the field of practical theology, particularly here in the U.S.? Another way of asking that was, what makes a course or text an expression of practical theology? Their answers were varied. I made a mind map. I made a mind map of the ideas and words that they used to discuss the characteristics of practical theology. As you know, with a cloud like this, the size of the words is determined by how often they come up in the conversation. So I took those and began to get them organized and decided that these were the two key characteristics that make up practical theology. One is the methodology, which is central. And the second that was brought up often by the women I interviewed was interdisciplinarity. So those two themes I want to spend just a few minutes talking about. Now, to talk about methodology is in fact the reflection on and the careful, critical read of the method that we're looking at. And here we're looking at the method of practical theology. And we can say three things about it. First of all, it's rooted in practice. It's important to recognize my first comment about that it's rooted in practice is the significance of context. By that I mean the setting and world in which we live and have our being. That we approach everything and interpret everything from that context. And one of the questions that get raised, particularly in the readings that I did for this research, is the question of the presence or lack of presence of what is referred to sometimes as raced bodies. That is, the lack of women or men of color in the guild, in theology in general, and in practical theology as well. In addition to that, Dr. Courtney Godot talks about, as an Asian American, talks about the challenge that she felt in having a situation in which the white perspective was normative, and she was aware of being conscious of what her white counterparts thought of her and understood her work to be. So that significance of the context is going to be an important one. I think Teresa mentioned that in her opening comment about why she became a practical theologian, because she values the importance of context and the way in which context is understood. The second element of this practice is that it's rooted in the breadth of practice. Now, clearly, if we're talking about practical theology, we begin with, or we certainly include, religious practices, personal communal devotion, etc. Okay, those are all part of the practice that we keep in mind as we engage in practical theology. But because we believe in a sacramental world, that is, a world in which God is present with us and expresses God's presence in the world around us, we recognize that other elements are also part of the practice that we need to consider. Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore talks about the practice of how we do immigration, the practice around peacemaking, the practice around the way in which we care for the earth. All of those are practices that we in fact can look at and gain insight into how we come to understand who God is, who humans are, and how they're in relationship with one another. And this dynamic of practical theology, rooted in practice, is really a contemplative consideration of practice. That is, it's a looking closely at how practice works and what practice says to us about who we are and who God is. Walter Burkhardt defines contemplation as a long, loving look at the real. I'm not sure if that quote was actually started with him, but in any case, I think that's a really good way to talk about the way in which we engage with practice in practical theology. That is, through reflection, contemplation, action, analysis, etc., we come to know the practice better and come to be able to bring that practice into dialogue with the tradition, which is the next aspect of practical theology. So it's rooted in practice, in dialogue with the tradition. Remember my earlier comment about the move from our understanding of theory and practice to recognizing this as praxis, that is, practice that informs theory and theory that informs practice. The dialogue that takes place there is one in which both the practice and the tradition are enhanced, challenged, questioned, investigated, and brought to clarity. So both practice and the tradition in this relationship, in this dynamic relationship between them, brings about changes in the way in which we think about the tradition and the way in which we engage in our practices. So it's always in dialogue with the tradition. And finally, it's about transforming the world. We're called as believers and as practical theologians to be about bringing about the reign of God. That responsibility involves not only proclaiming the gospel in word, but proclaiming in a transformed world. And so the work of a practical theologian is to raise questions and comments and to be activists at times in transforming the world in light of the gospel. So that's the method of practical theology, rooted in practice, in dialogue with the tradition about transforming the world. Let me make one more comment on this. I think that in the things that I read, in the materials that I read and in the interviews, there was a real recognition of the dynamism between practice and transforming the world. It was recognizing that we transform the world by how we transform our practices, that those are intimately connected and intimately influenced. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about in talking about the nature of practical theology is to look at the sense of interdisciplinarity. We can talk about this as resources for looking at practice. If we're examining practice closely, we want to draw on other resources that help us to understand it. Resources like the human or social sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, political science, etc. Arts and humanities, for example, literature, performative arts, visual arts, etc. And then most recently, the neurosciences and related fields to that. That is, our coming to know how the human brain develops and how human pathways develop in our brains emphasizes the importance of practices and the way in which practices shape us to be people more in touch with who God is and more aware of God's presence. Now, there are challenges to that. Okay, there's challenges to using these resources. One is, I'm not a neuroscientist. I often think to myself as I go into my class, I'm not a social scientist, but I play one in the classroom. That there's a way in which we bring the insights of those fields into dialogue with practical theology. So the challenges are the authentic use of other methodologies. In what way are we using that method or that approach appropriately? Or are we watering it down or finessing it as to fit our needs without being respectful to the discipline itself? How do we go about maintaining, in that context, a sense of identity as a theologian? This is going to come up again when we look at some of the hopes and concerns for the future. But the question is that sometimes following resources from other disciplines is an interesting kind of shiny new toy for practical theologians. And we need to be careful not to take on these different approaches naively. We need to be careful to take them on with a recognition that behind them is a certain presumption about the human person that may or may not be in conflict with how Christianity understands the human person. And so how we use and engage those disciplines and those methodologies is clear. And I think it seems to me that our responses are twofold. One is consulting with people who actually are neuroscientists and social scientists, et cetera, working with them in complementary work and in mutual projects. And then I think a healthy sense of humility, that for us to appropriate resources from outside the discipline into which we've been apprenticed raises questions about the field. And recognizing the importance of seeing those connections is clear. I'd like to make some final comments about the challenges and hopes for the future. And so I asked the people I interviewed, I said it was crystal ball time. What do you see as the hopes and challenges for practical theology into the future? And I'm going to let them again speak for themselves. And this is one of the challenges that Colleen Griffith mentioned. Noting the role of interdisciplinarity, how we embark on that matters. We decide what discipline we need to be in conversation with to read the signs of the times accurately, to read the contextual situation well. All of these things matter. But staying a theologian in the midst of all that is something I'm concerned about. I've seen a little bit of recent practical theology that emerges as sociology of religion. And the person has gone the interdisciplinary route entirely and have lost their home base as theologian. Practical theologians need to be very clear about their domain being theoretical firstly and lastly, and their conversation with other disciplines being at the service of that. So that's Colleen's concern, that in engaging interdisciplinarity, we recognize our foundation and our root within theology. Mary Elizabeth Moore said, I think another challenge is to enhance diversity, to contribute to the diversity and our respect for diversity and learn from diversity in human life and in the field. I think people who engage with practices are going to be engaged with diversity no matter what. You can't study human practices without encountering immense diversity and uniqueness as well. And you can't study the practices of trees without finding diversity as well. So contributing to the diversity itself and at the same time respecting and learning from it. And then the final one is from Teresa, who gives us a hope. The hopeful thing is that people are really struggling with reality in productive and creative and inventive ways. That is what I find really exciting and hopeful. Let's really think about this. Let's try something different. Let's see what we learn in the doing. And if we find something that is working, let's do more of that. And I would add to her comment that for me, one of the signs of hopes for the future of practical theology are our doctoral students. This past year, we admitted 3 young women who are bringing interesting questions and ideas into our discussion, and will themselves someday give this lecture. And I can hardly wait to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Regan. Really appreciate your lecture. You gave us lots to think about, and we're going to dive right into questions. First question for you. Thank you. What did you find most interesting when you were doing your research and your interviews?
How much was in common? I think I was struck particularly by the fact that the methodology was such a driving force in people's connection with practical theology. That is, as Teresa said, she didn't go out to be a practical theology. She was a religious educator. And the way in which she claimed herself as a practical theologian was because of that methodology, that move from practice to connection with the tradition to participating in the transformation of the world. That movement is very much the movement that she found inviting, as did Colleen and Mary Elizabeth Moore. And I found that kind of consistency interesting. One of the things I found surprising, different kind of question, but one of the things I found surprising was that there was a good deal of concern and interest in diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. But there was interesting in that nothing was written in any of those books about how the LGBTQIA plus group is part of the question and part of the conversation. And I wonder what other groups or what other people are not being included in practical theology that would enhance practical theology, because their practice is different, their context is different, and the way in which they engage with the gospel is different. And so giving them kind of a chance to have their voices heard, I think would enhance the field.
Thank you. We've had a couple questions in the Q&A about the interdisciplinarity that you mentioned, and just some clarifying questions. So one person just wants to be able to better grasp the parameters of practical theology. Does something like work in palliative care from a Christian perspective or bioethics in the same area constitute practical theology?
That's an interesting question. Let me do 2 things. Let me begin by talking a bit about interdisciplinarity in general. I'll give you an example from my own work. Okay. The recent book that I published, Where 2 or 3 are Gathered, looks at the notion of communities of practice. Now, that sense of communities of practice comes out of education and business, the business world. Okay, so that I need to then take that on, or I chose to take that on, because I want to argue that really we become Christians by hanging out with other Christians. The communities of practice is based on the idea that you become part of a group, take on an identity by being part of the group. And so I was arguing that you become a Christian by hanging out with other Christians. Now, the problem is the communities of practice doesn't necessarily have the same theological anthropology or the same understanding of the human person that we have within Christianity. So we need to be careful in taking these on. But at the same time, it provides a rich resource for how we understand how committees in a parish can be faith formative, or how participating in a group within a parish helps me feel like I belong more. So those are part of the ways in which that happens. Another example is one that Teresa O'Keefe is working on, in which she's working with developmental theory to talk about the way in which youth and young adults grow in their understanding of meaning making and effectiveness in the world. And she's doing this in dialogue with people from the education department. So she's working on a major project to work up a tool for evaluating the way in which people develop and mature in their meaningful life. So again, drawing on resources from outside the discipline. Now, one of the questions is ethics actually a practical theology area, actually in the practical theology area? And that's up to the ethicists, I think, to decide. But in many ways, they are about the same activity. They are about being aware of and attentive to the practice and the context of the people with whom they work, and see that as a way of engaging with the tradition, and from that, being about the process of transforming the world. So yes, I would say in many ways, certainly being a palliative care nurse or working in any field like that would be part of practical theology.
And just to continue on this topic of the interdisciplinarity, like, I think very practical question for practical theology, if we're hosting a faith formation session on faith and mental health, would you recommend bringing in an expert in that field so it is truly interdisciplinary? So bring in a therapist or a psychiatrist to speak to mental illness. So how the doing of it, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I very much would. There ought to be a difference in what we do on, for example, addressing mental health issues, on what happens at a talk or presentation in a parish, and what happens at the presentation at the local civic center. Those ought to be different, because there's a different anthropology that's behind it. But drawing on the resources of other people engaged in the field who can bring in the insights and understandings of the experience of mental illness is an essential part of it. And so a team taught kind of thing, where you have a pastoral minister who engages with people who are dealing with mental health issues, as well as a mental health professional, would be an ideal.
Thank you. Another question for you. So you mentioned both practices and the tradition are revelatory. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sometimes we can be uncomfortable with that. We think that the tradition or the gospel or church teaching is revelatory, and our experience is our experience. But what practical theology is arguing is that if we believe that God is present in the world around us and present in our lives, then we can learn what God is asking of us. We can learn and we can develop our understanding of who God is and who human beings are by reflecting that long, loving look at our practices and the way in which our practices shape us. So, for example, an easy, kind of a simple example is, if you find yourself, if you start practicing meditation and find yourself more patient, more calm, etc., yes, that's meditation. That meditation can help you do that. But in fact, we also recognize that's God working through that. That we recognize it and we interpret it as a sign of God's presence. And our being more calm, less likely to snap at our kids or whatever, that's part of the way in which we transform the world. So I think that both the tradition and our experience in different ways are revelatory of God's presence and are revelatory of God's action in the world. And that our experience brings questions to the tradition and to the way in which the tradition has been expressed. And those questions are questions that need to be answered and need to be addressed.
Thank you. Another question. Did the Synod on Synodality come up in your research, or how that might impact the field for practical theologians?
No, it didn't come up, and I think some of that is just timing. But I think one of the questions that the Synod on Synodality raises for us, and this is coming from me as an adult educator and practical theologian, is how do we engage people in conversations that are being expected of us with the synod? In other words, if the gist of it is, as Pope Francis says, that synodality is in fact the nature of the church. This isn't a new program. This isn't a new approach we're going to take to get more people back in the church. This is the way we are as church. Then what's the way in which we can help adults come to know and to engage in effective conversation? That's to me, that's an important aspect of our work with adults and our work with people within the community. And so, in some way, I think that the synod provides a wonderful opportunity for us to bring some of the insights from adult faith formation and from practical theology into the life of the parish. So I think there's some good insight there.
Thank you. We've had a couple comments just trying to define, who would be a practical theologian. So I guess the question would be, what do you recommend to assess or discern if someone is indeed a practical theologian? If they're a chaplain in a hospital, are they a practical theologian, or is it a little bit more formal definition?
Well, somebody like Karl Rahner would say we're all theologians. That the very work of living in the world as a Christian involves doing theology. That is, reflecting on our experience in light of the gospel. That's doing theology, okay? And that's particularly doing practical theology. So I think in many ways, we're all in some way practical theologians. Now, happily, we have some people who are systematic theologians, biblical theologians, etc., who do other kinds of things that support the work. But that practical theologian is the person who brings their experience into dialogue with the tradition, and from that enter into the process of transforming the world. So in that sense, I think most people in ministry are in some way engaged in practical theology. Now, meanwhile, there's a kind of a more formal defined notion of practical theology. But I think we saw in each of the three people that we looked at that nobody told them they were practical theologians, that in fact they claimed being a practical theologian. And it's interesting that there's a real dearth of places where you can actually get a doctorate in practical theology. There was one, I don't think that's existing anymore. So many times practical theologians are in fact religious educators, people involved in pastoral care and counseling, homilists, liturgists. Those are people who are practical theologians. But certainly the minister on the ground is a practical theologian.
Thank you. One of our participants would like to know, who are women theologians or professionals who've inspired you on your own journey as a practical theologian?
Excellent question. Need to think about that one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It is a good question. Do you have any other good questions I could answer instead? Well, probably, as I think about it, certainly the religious educators in my life have formed me as a practical theologian. It's religious educators who have helped me to see the connection between my experience and the gospel. But I have to say, working here at the School of Theology and Ministry has been a wonderful opportunity to engage with women theologians from a variety of fields and areas. I mentioned Francine Cardman in the beginning, and she was a wonderful church historian. And we have other women here at the School of Theology and Ministry who are systematic theologians, etc. And they bring to me an inspiration of what being a woman theologian in the church can mean for us. So I'm always excited when we get a new doctoral group of doctoral students in. And this past year, we had 3 women come in. We accept 3 people a year, and 3 of them were women. And it's wonderful to see that kind of connection, that kind of interest.
Thank you. One of our participants is asking, in your research did you see anything distinct about women's voices that added distinctness to pastoral theology? I'm sorry, I butchered their question, but it was, anything distinctly about women and the pastoral theology.
Well, to some extent that's hard to answer because I didn't do men, so it's hard to say. But I do think, I mentioned earlier, that I do think the fact that these are all collected issues, collected books, collected essays, and that they're collected by women says something. Like there aren't a counterpart of a bunch of collected essays by men that have been edited by men. And so I think that sense of women working together in doing theology and engaging in theological reflection is an important aspect and contribution to the church. So I would say that would be one that would be present. The other thing that I found was that certainly in the women that I interviewed, as well as in some of the writing, a real concern kind of for creation, for their bodiliness, as Colleen would say, or for the created order, as Mary Elizabeth Moore might say. And so I think that there's an interest there that may very well be echoed with men, but I see it very clearly in the women's writing as well.
And then there was another question about your research, like what particular communities were included. Was it mostly Catholic communities? Was it broader? Was it more specific within the Catholic tradition?
Yeah, it was fairly specific within the Catholic tradition, and it looked at the way in which parishes organized their committees and groups that meet. That basically the thesis was this, that I belong to a parish, or I say I belong to a parish when I belong to something smaller than the parish. So you say, yeah, I've been going to St. Timothy's forever, but really it was when my children started religious education, I started being a catechist, or when I joined the choir, or when I became part of the book club, that I felt like I belonged. Okay, so we belong to smaller groups. Excuse me. And the way in which those smaller groups can be faith formative was really the focus of my study.
We're running a little short on time, so I thought maybe we could close with this question. You mentioned that you find hope in these young students that are coming to study and become practical theologians. Do you have any advice or words of wisdom that you would pass along to the next generation?
The first thing that came to mind was be brave. I'm not sure where that came from, but I'll take it as a word of wisdom. I think coming into owning their own identity and claiming their own place as a practical theologian would be key elements that I would recommend to them. And as I recommend to everybody who does doctoral study, be sure to keep a novel going. Okay, read a novel. Don't read only theology. Read something that gives you a sense of who people are and what people are doing, and that will serve you well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Regan. And thank you for our participants for joining us. If I didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. We can include a list of the Q&A to send to Dr. Regan after our event today. So thank you. Thank you for being with us today. I also want to remind you of our final event of the semester is going to be a week from today, next Thursday, May 5th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join us virtually like you are today, but we'll also be in person on campus here at Boston College. And it's going to be Father Stegman presenting Text Less Traveled, What Would Be Missed Without Them. We're going to send a follow-up email that details the registration for this event. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Regan.
Thank you.